The autumn wind of 1893 carried the scent of pine needles and something else through the narrow streets of Briarwood, something the townspeople couldn't quite name but had grown accustomed to over the decades. It was the smell of secrets buried deep, of prayers left unanswered, and of a man who had never truly belonged to the world of the living. Pastor Elias Morrow stood at his study window, watching the last leaves fall from the ancient oak that had witnessed nearly 4 decades of his ministry. His reflection in the glass was gaunt, ethereal, a man who seemed to exist somewhere between this world and another. The deep lines etched into his face told stories that no congregation member had ever been brave enough to ask about. At 62, Morrow had never taken a wife, never traveled beyond the town's borders, never missed a single Sunday service. The people of Briarwood had built their lives around his unwavering presence, like a lighthouse that had guided ships through treacherous waters for so long that no one remembered what the waters looked like without it. "Pastor?" came a timid voice from behind him. Morrow turned slowly, his pale gray eyes settling on young Timothy Hartwell, the church's newest deacon. The boy, for at 19 he was still very much a boy, clutched a leather-bound ledger against his chest like a shield. "The collection from last Sunday, sir. Mrs. Patterson wanted me to ask about the discrepancy." Morrow's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile on any other man's face, but on his, it resembled something carved from marble. "Discrepancy, Timothy? Well, sir, the amount we collected versus what was recorded. There seems to be some money missing, and Mrs. Patterson, she's been keeping the books for 20 years and she's never seen." "Tell Mrs. Patterson," Morrow interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of granite, "that some offerings are not meant for earthly ledgers." Timothy's young face paled. He had heard whispers about Pastor Morrow, fragments of conversations that ceased the moment he entered a room, glances exchanged between the older parishioners that carried decades of unspoken knowledge. But he had never felt the full weight of the man's presence until this moment. Yes, sir. I'll tell her." As Timothy hurried from the study, Morrow returned his gaze to the window. In the distance, the cemetery sprawled across a small hill, its weathered headstones like broken teeth against the gray sky. Some of those graves held secrets that would make the living weep. Others held nothing at all. The church bell began to toll, calling the faithful to evening prayer. But tonight, for the first time in 39 years, Pastor Morrow would not answer its call. Instead, he walked to his desk and opened the bottom drawer, the one that had remained locked for decades. Inside lay an ancient leather journal, its pages yellowed with age and stained with substances that were decidedly not ink. The journal had been waiting, patient as death itself, for the right moment to be opened again. Morrow's fingers traced the worn cover, feeling the raised symbols that had been carved into the leather by hands long since turned to dust. Tomorrow was Palm Sunday, the beginning of Holy Week, and Easter. Easter would mark exactly 40 years since he had first arrived in Briarwood. 40 years since the last pastor had disappeared without a trace. 40 years since Elias Morrow had made a promise that could only be kept in blood. As he opened the journal, the scent that had haunted Briarwood for decades grew stronger. It was the smell of earth turned fresh, of copper pennies left in the rain, and of promises that demanded payment in full. Outside, the church bell continued to toll, but the sound seemed different now, less like a call to worship and more like a countdown to something the people of Briarwood were not prepared to face. Pastor Morrow began to read, and with each word, the shadows in his study grew longer, reaching toward corners that had never known darkness before. The final chapter of his ministry was about to begin. Spring arrived in Briarwood with an unusual urgency in 1894, as if nature itself was racing toward some predetermined conclusion. The snow melted faster than anyone could remember, leaving the ground soggy and unstable, perfect for things long buried to work their way back to the surface. Margaret Patterson had been the church secretary for 2 decades, and in all that time she had never questioned Pastor Morrow's methods. But lately, something had been gnawing at her, a persistent unease that made her stomach turn whenever she thought about the missing collection money, or the way certain families had simply stopped attending services over the years. She sat in her modest kitchen, surrounded by ledgers and record books, trying to make sense of patterns that seemed to defy explanation. The Whitman family, gone after their youngest daughter, fell ill with a fever that no doctor could cure. The Brennans, vanished overnight after old Thomas claimed he heard voices calling from beneath the church floorboards. The Crows, the Hendersons, the Mackenzie clan all disappeared over the decades, leaving behind empty houses that no one dared to occupy. 23 families, Margaret whispered to herself, her finger tracing down a list she had compiled in secret. 23 families in 39 years. Her husband, Robert, looked up from his evening paper. "What's that, dear?" Margaret quickly closed the ledger. "Nothing, just church business." But it wasn't nothing, and they both knew it. Robert had lived in Briarwood his entire life, and he remembered the whispers that had followed Pastor Morrow's arrival. How the previous pastor, Father William Ashford, had simply walked out of his home one morning and never returned. How Morrow had appeared that same day, carrying nothing but a worn Bible and claiming to have been sent by the diocese, though no one had ever been able to confirm his credentials. "Margaret," Robert said quietly, folding his paper, "maybe it's time to stop asking questions that don't want to be answered." Before she could respond, a knock echoed through their small house. Margaret opened the door to find Timothy Hartwell standing on her porch, his face pale and his hands trembling. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I need to show you something. It's about the church, about Pastor Morrow." Against her husband's protests, Margaret followed Timothy through the darkened streets of Briarwood. The young man led her to the church, where he produced a key to the side entrance. A key he shouldn't have had. "I made a copy," he admitted shamefully. "I've been trying to understand the discrepancies in the collection records, and I thought maybe if I could look at Pastor Morrow's private records." They slipped inside the church, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Timothy lit a single candle, casting dancing shadows across the empty pews. In the dim light, the stained glass windows looked less like depictions of saints and more like warnings of judgment. "I found this," Timothy whispered, leading her to the altar. Behind it, hidden by a loose floorboard, was a metal box. Inside were dozens of documents, records that painted a picture Margaret wished she had never seen. Deed transfers for the properties of the missing families, all signed over to the church just before their disappearances. Financial records showing large sums of money being spent on supplies that made no sense for a house of worship: shovels, lime, steel chains. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in oilcloth, was a list written in Pastor Morrow's careful handwriting. It was a roster of names with dates beside each one. Some names had been crossed out in red ink. Others remained untouched, waiting. Margaret's name was on the list. So was Timothy's. "We have to leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We have to leave Briarwood tonight." But as they turned toward the exit, they heard the unmistakable sound of the church doors closing. The heavy wooden bar slid into place with a finality that made Margaret's blood run cold. From the shadows near the pulpit, Pastor Morrow stepped into the candlelight. He was still wearing his black clerical robes, but there was something different about him, something that made the very air around him feel thick and oppressive. "I'm afraid you've seen too much," he said, his voice carrying an otherworldly resonance. "But don't worry. Your names are on the list for a reason. You'll understand everything very soon." In his hand was the ancient journal Margaret had glimpsed him reading during recent services. Its pages fluttered open of their own accord, revealing text that seemed to writhe and move in the flickering candlelight. "Easter is coming," Morrow continued, his pale eyes reflecting the flame like a predator's in the dark, "and 40 years of faithful service deserves a proper celebration. You'll both have front row seats for my final sermon." Margaret grabbed Timothy's hand and ran toward the windows, but they were too high, too small. The church that had been their sanctuary for decades had become their prison, and in the darkness beyond the candlelight, they could hear something stirring, something that had been waiting beneath the floorboards for a very long time. The basement of Briarwood's church had been sealed for as long as anyone could remember. The official story was that it had flooded during the severe winter of 1856, making it unsafe for use. But Margaret Patterson and Timothy Hartwell were about to discover that some floods wash things down, while others wash things up. Pastor Morrow had left them locked in the church overnight, promising to return for Easter Sunday. Margaret had spent hours trying to calm Timothy, whose young mind was struggling to process what they had witnessed. But as dawn broke through the stained glass windows, casting colored light across the empty pews, they heard something that made them both freeze. Scratching. coming from beneath the floor. "It's probably just rats," Timothy whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Margaret knew better. She had lived in Briarwood long enough to recognize the sound of fingernails against wood, the desperate clawing of something that wanted out. Or someone. "Help me move this," she said, pointing to the altar. It was heavier than it looked, but fear gave them strength. Beneath it, they found what Pastor Morrow had been hiding for 4 decades. A trapdoor, sealed with chains and marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The scratching grew louder. "Mrs. Patterson," came a voice from below, weak, rasping, but unmistakably human. "Please, we've been waiting so long." Margaret's hands shook as she fumbled with the chains. They were old but well-maintained, oiled and cared for like everything else in Pastor Morrow's domain. When the last link finally fell away, the trapdoor swung open, releasing a stench that made them both gag. The basement was deeper than any church had a right to be, its walls carved from the living rock beneath Briarwood, and in the flickering light that filtered down from above, they could see them. The missing families, or what was left of them. They were alive, if the word could still apply to what they had become. Pale, emaciated figures chained to the walls, their eyes reflecting the light like animals. Some wore the rotted remains of clothes from decades past. Others had been down there so long that their skin had taken on the color and texture of the stone itself. "He feeds us," whispered a woman who might have once been Sarah Whitman. "Once a week, he brings us communion. Bread made from things that grow in the dark. Wine that tastes like copper and memories." Timothy vomited into the corner, but Margaret forced herself to descend the rough-hewn steps. At the far end of the basement, she found a man chained apart from the others. Unlike the rest, he still wore the collar of a priest. "Father Ashford?" she breathed. The man raised his head slowly. His hair had gone completely white, and his face was gaunt beyond recognition, but his eyes still held a spark of the man he had once been. He came 40 years ago," Ashford whispered. "Said he was my replacement, sent by God to take over my ministry. But he wasn't sent by God, Mrs. Patterson. He was sent by something else, something that's been waiting in the darkness since before men built churches." "What does he want?" "A congregation that will never leave, never question, never die." Ashford's chains rattled as he tried to move closer. "Every 7 years, he adds new members to his permanent flock. The living above and the undying below. He feeds off their faith, their fear, their slowly fading humanity." Margaret looked around at the pitiful figures chained to the walls. How many? Everyone who ever asked too many questions. Everyone who got too close to the truth. Their families think they moved away, but they're still here, still listening to his sermons, still part of his congregation. But why? What is he? Father Ashford's laugh was like the sound of dry leaves cracking. Something old. Something that wears the shape of a man but serves masters that predate Christ by millennia. He told me once during one of his visits that every town needs a shepherd, and every shepherd needs a flock that will never stray. Above them, they heard the church doors opening. Heavy footsteps echoed across the floor, accompanied by the sound of something being dragged. "He's back," whispered Sarah Whitman, and all the imprisoned figures pressed themselves against the walls as if trying to disappear into the stone. "Margaret! Timothy!" Pastor Morrow's voice carried down into the basement like a funeral bell. "I see you've met the rest of my congregation. How wonderful. You can all get acquainted before tonight's service." Margaret grabbed Timothy's arm and pushed him toward the ladder. "Run. When you get up there, run for the doors. Don't look back. I can't leave you. You have to. Someone has to warn the others." But as Timothy reached the top of the ladder, Pastor Morrow appeared at the opening. In his hand was not the ancient journal, but something worse, a ceremonial knife, its blade stained black with substances that should not exist. "Going somewhere?" Morrow asked, his voice carrying an inhuman resonance. "But the service hasn't even started yet, and tonight is special. Tonight, after 40 years of faithful ministry, I finally complete the ritual that will bind this entire town to my will forever." He gestured toward the basement, where shadows moved independently of their sources. "One more night with your new friends, and then Easter Sunday will begin. My final sermon will echo through these walls, and everyone in Briarwood will hear it. whether they're in the pews above or the stones below. As the trapdoor slammed shut above them, plunging the basement back into darkness, Margaret heard something that chilled her more than the cold stone walls. Singing. Dozens of voices, raised in harmony, coming from the deepest recesses of the basement where not even Timothy's candle had reached. Pastor Morrow's congregation was larger than anyone in Briarwood had ever imagined, and they were all getting ready for church. Easter Sunday dawned gray and cold over Briarwood, with clouds that hung low enough to touch the church steeple. The townspeople woke to find notices slipped under their doors during the night. Invitations written in Pastor Morrow's careful script, requesting their presence at a special Easter service that would begin at dawn and continue until, well, the notices didn't specify when it would end. Mary Hutchinson folded her invitation with trembling fingers. She had been planning to skip church that morning, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely false. For weeks now, she had been having dreams about her sister Emma, who had supposedly moved to California 5 years ago, but had never written even once. In the dreams, Emma was calling for help from somewhere dark and cold, somewhere that smelled of earth and decay. But the invitation was not really an invitation at all. It was a summons, written in words that seemed to crawl across the page when she wasn't looking directly at them. And at the bottom, in smaller text, was a message that made her blood run cold. Attendance is not optional. The flock must be complete. Across town, similar scenes were playing out in every household. Robert Patterson found his wife's note explaining where she had gone, along with one of the strange invitations. He crushed the paper in his fist, but when he opened his hand again, the words had changed. Robert Patterson, last pew, right side. Your wife is waiting. Dr. Henry Blackwood, the town's physician, read his invitation while examining the strange rash that had appeared on his hands overnight. A rash that looked suspiciously like text in a language he had never seen before. The invitation promised answers to questions he had been asking for years about the unusually high rate of disappearances in Briarwood. By the time the church bell began to toll at dawn, every remaining resident of Briarwood was walking through the streets toward the white-painted building that had been the center of their community for generations. They moved like sleepwalkers, their faces blank, their eyes fixed on the steeple that seemed to pierce the low-hanging clouds. Inside the church, Pastor Morrow made his final preparations. The basement trapdoor had been opened, allowing some of his longer-term congregation members to join the service. They sat in the shadows at the back of the church, their pale faces turned toward the altar with an attention that bordered on worship. Margaret Patterson and Timothy Hartwell were chained to seats in the front row, where they could see everything that was about to unfold. "Welcome," Morrow said as the last townsperson filed into the pews, "to my final sermon." He had changed from his usual black robes into something older, something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The ancient journal lay open on the pulpit, its pages turning of their own accord in the still air of the church. "For 40 years I have served as your shepherd. I have guided you, protected you, and prepared you for this moment. Some of you may have wondered why certain families left our community over the years. Others may have questioned the nature of my ministry, the source of my dedication." As he spoke, the church doors swung shut with a sound like thunder. The heavy wooden bar slid into place, sealing everyone inside. "The truth is simple," Morrow continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I am not like other pastors. I serve masters who predate your Christ, your Bible, your very concept of salvation. I am what you might call a shepherd of souls, not to deliver them to heaven, but to gather them for a harvest that has been 40 years in the making." Dr. Blackwood tried to stand, but found that his legs would not obey him. Around the church, other townspeople struggled against the same invisible force that held them in their seats like iron shackles. "You see," Morrow said, beginning to read from the ancient journal, "every community needs a protector. Something to keep the outside world from asking too many questions about missing persons, unexplained disappearances, families that simply vanish overnight. I have been that protector for Briarwood. In return, all I asked was your faith, your attendance, and eventually, your souls." The text he read was not in English or any human language that had ever been spoken on earth. As the words filled the air, the stained glass windows began to darken, as if something was pressing against them from outside. The temperature in the church dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. Some of you thought you could leave, Morrow said, his pale eyes scanning the congregation. Some of you thought you could hide, but there is no escape from a shepherd who knows his flock. There is no hiding from a pastor who sees into the darkest corners of your souls. From the basement came sounds that no human throat could produce, howling, crying, singing in harmonies that hurt to hear. The imprisoned families were adding their voices to the ritual, willing or not. And now, Morrow said, raising the ceremonial knife that gleamed despite the darkness gathering in the church, after 40 years of faithful service, it is time for the final communion, time for you to join my permanent congregation. Time for Briarwood to become what it was always meant to be, a place where the faithful never leave, never doubt, and never die. The knife began to glow with a light that was somehow darker than the shadows around it, and as Pastor Morrow raised it above his head, Margaret Patterson realized with crystal clarity that no one in Briarwood was going home that Easter Sunday. The final sermon had begun, and its conclusion would echo through eternity. Outside the church, the sky grew darker still, and somewhere in the distance, church bells from towns that no longer existed began to toll in harmony with Briarwood's own bell. The harvest was about to begin. The ancient words flowing from Pastor Morrow's lips seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on the trapped congregation like invisible hands. As he read from the journal, the very air in the church grew thick and oppressive, making it difficult to breathe. The stained glass windows had gone completely black, as if night had fallen in the middle of the morning. Margaret Patterson fought against the supernatural force holding her in place, her mind racing for any possible escape. Beside her, Timothy Hartwell had gone pale, his young faith crumbling as he witnessed the true nature of the man they had trusted for so long. "Please," Dr. Blackwood managed to gasp from somewhere in the middle pews, "there are children here. Whatever you want, take it from me, but let the children go." Pastor Morrow paused in his reading, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Dr. Blackwood, always the healer, always trying to protect others, but you misunderstand the nature of what's happening here. The children aren't victims, they're the most precious part of the harvest. Young souls burn brighter, last longer." 8-year-old Sarah Chen began to cry, and her mother, Linda, struggled desperately against her invisible bonds. "Please, she's just a baby." "She's a soul," Morrow corrected, "and souls belong to those strong enough to claim them." As he spoke, the basement trapdoor began to widen of its own accord, revealing more of the church's hidden congregation. Margaret could see dozens of pale faces in the darkness below, people she had known, families she had mourned, all staring up at the proceedings with eyes that reflected no light. But something was wrong. The ritual wasn't proceeding as smoothly as Morrow had expected. The ancient journal's pages were fluttering more rapidly now, and the text seemed to be fighting against his voice, as if two forces were warring for control. Father Ashford's voice rose from the basement, weak but determined. He's losing control. The binding isn't complete. The original protection's on this ground. They're still fighting him." Morrow's head snapped toward the basement opening, his composure cracking for the first time. "Impossible. I sanctified this ground with 40 years of offerings. I fed it blood and fear and faith. But not willingly given," Ashford called back. "Not freely offered. You took everything by force, and the land remembers. Holy ground recognizes the difference between sacrifice and slaughter." The struggle in Morrow's voice was becoming apparent now. The words of the ritual were fighting him, requiring more and more effort to pronounce. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the supernatural cold filling the church. Margaret felt the invisible force holding her beginning to weaken. She tested her bonds carefully, finding that she could move her hand slightly. Beside her, Timothy was doing the same. "The knife," she whispered urgently. "If we can get the knife away from him," but Timothy was staring at something behind the altar that made his face go white. "Mrs. Patterson, look." Rising from the shadows behind the pulpit was a figure that hurt to look at directly. It was tall and thin, dressed in robes that seemed to be cut from the fabric of night itself. Where its face should have been was a void that pulled at the eye like a black hole, and when it spoke, its voice was the sound of wind through empty graveyards. "Elias," it said, and the name carried the weight of judgment. "You have failed us. 40 years of preparation and you cannot even bind a single congregation." Morrow fell to his knees before the entity. the ceremonial knife clattering to the floor. "Master, the protections are stronger than I anticipated. Give me more time." "Time is a luxury for the living," the entity replied. "You have had your chance. Now, we will finish this ourselves." The thing that had once called itself Pastor Morrow began to change. His skin grew pale and translucent, his eyes sank into dark hollows, and his movements took on the jerky, unnatural quality of a marionette, controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. Whatever had been inhabiting his body for 40 years was taking more direct control, but the change seemed to weaken the supernatural bonds holding the congregation. People began to gasp and move, some falling forward out of their pews as feeling returned to their limbs. "Now!" Margaret shouted, lunging for the fallen knife. The church erupted into chaos. Some townspeople ran for the sealed doors, pounding against them desperately. Others, led by Dr. Blackwood, rushed toward the altar, and from the basement came the sound of chains breaking as the long-imprisoned congregation began to fight back against their captor. Father Ashford's voice rose above the tumult, speaking words of benediction and protection that seemed to burn the air itself. The entity behind the altar recoiled, its form becoming less solid. "Get the journal," Ashford called. "Destroy the journal and you break the binding." Timothy reached the pulpit first, his young hands grasping the ancient book. But the moment he touched it, he screamed and jerked back, his palms burned by contact with the unholy text. Margaret snatched up a candlestick and brought it down on the journal with all her strength. The book erupted in flames that burned cold and bright, and the entity's shriek of rage shattered every piece of glass in the church. The thing that had been Pastor Morrow lunged toward them, but its form was already beginning to dissolve. Whatever force had kept it anchored to the physical world was unraveling along with the destroyed ritual. "This isn't over," it hissed as it faded. "There are other towns, other congregations, other shepherds to gather the flock." And then it was gone, leaving behind only the smell of sulfur and the sound of chains breaking in the basement below. The church doors burst open, letting in the gray light of Easter morning. For the first time in 40 years, the congregation of Briarwood was free to leave. But as they stumbled out into the daylight, they realized that their ordeal was far from over. The thing that had controlled Pastor Morrow was gone, but it had left behind 40 years of damage that would take generations to heal. And somewhere in the distance, other church bells were tolling, calling other congregations to services they might never leave. 3 days after Easter Sunday, Briarwood looked like a town recovering from a war that no one could properly explain. Federal marshals had arrived after Dr. Blackwood managed to get word to the outside world, but their investigation was hampered by evidence that defied rational explanation and witnesses whose stories sounded like the ravings of madmen. Margaret Patterson sat in her kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Her hands were bandaged from where she had grabbed the ceremonial knife, and her arms bore rope burns from the chains that had held her in the church basement. But the physical wounds were nothing compared to the psychological trauma of learning that her entire adult life had been shaped by something that should not have existed. The rescued families from the basement were in the county hospital, most of them catatonic from decades of imprisonment. Dr. Blackwood worked around the clock to help them. But how do you treat patients who claim to remember every moment of 40 years in captivity? How do you help someone whose body has forgotten how to process normal food after subsisting on whatever unholy sustenance Pastor Morrow had provided? Father Ashford was the exception. Despite his long imprisonment, he retained enough of his sanity to help the investigators understand what had happened. He sat now in Margaret's parlor, wearing borrowed clothes that hung loose on his emaciated frame, trying to explain the inexplicable. "It was a harvester," he said for the third time to the federal marshal who was taking notes. "A collector of souls that serves entities older than recorded history. They find communities isolated enough to operate without interference, then establish control through religious authority." Marshal Thompson, a practical man from Boston who had seen his share of strange cases, set down his pen and rubbed his temples. "Father, I've documented 37 people who were presumed dead but were found alive in that basement. I've got witness testimony of supernatural phenomena that would make Edgar Allan Poe blush, but I still need something I can put in an official report. Put that Pastor Elias Morrow was an imposter who held the town under control through fear and superstition," Father Ashford suggested. Put that he kept prisoners in a hidden basement and used psychological manipulation to maintain his hold over the community. It's not the whole truth, but it's enough truth to satisfy bureaucracy. Timothy Hartwell, who had barely spoken since the ordeal, looked up from where he sat by the window. What about the other towns? That thing said there were other shepherds, other congregations. The room fell silent. It was the question they had all been avoiding, the implication that made sleep impossible and turned every church bell into a source of dread. I've been thinking about that, Father Ashford said slowly. I had 40 years to think, actually. And I remember conversations, fragments of things it said when it thought I couldn't understand. There are others. Small towns, isolated communities, places where a charismatic pastor could establish control and maintain it for decades. Margaret's hands shook as she finally lifted her coffee cup. How do we know which towns? How do we warn people? We can't, Marshall Thompson said grimly. Think about it. If I went to the authorities in, say, Millhaven or Cedar Ridge and told them their beloved pastor might be a soul-harvesting entity, what do you think would happen? I'd be laughed out of office at best, committed to an asylum at worst. So we do nothing? Timothy's voice cracked with frustration. We just let other people suffer what we went through? Father Ashford leaned forward, his weathered face grave. We do what we can. We watch for signs. Pastors who never leave their communities, never marry, never seem to age normally. Towns where families disappear without explanation. Churches with sealed basements or areas that are off limits to the congregation. And then what? Margaret asked. Then we fight, Ashford said simply. The entity that controlled Morrow was powerful, but it wasn't invincible. It required specific conditions: isolated communities, willing congregation, consecrated ground corrupted slowly over time. If we can identify other harvesters before they complete their 40-year cycles. He trailed off, but they all understood. They were talking about becoming hunters, seeking out monsters that wore the faces of holy men. Over the following weeks, as Briarwood slowly began to heal, word spread through unofficial channels. Dr. Blackwood corresponded with colleagues in other states, sharing carefully worded warnings about religious communities that seemed too isolated, too devoted, too afraid to ask questions. Margaret began keeping records of missing persons reports from small towns across the country, looking for patterns that might indicate supernatural influence. Timothy, despite his youth, threw himself into research with the fervor of the converted. He pored over historical records, looking for other communities that had experienced similar unexplained disappearances or had pastors with impossible longevity. The church in Briarwood remained empty. No one had the heart to hold services there, even after Father Ashford blessed the building and sealed the basement with concrete. Too much blood had been spilled, too many prayers had been corrupted, too many souls had suffered within those walls. But in the town square, they erected a simple monument, not to memorialize the dead, for most of the missing were still alive and recovering, but to remember the importance of questioning authority, of maintaining skepticism even in matters of faith, and of never allowing fear to silence doubt. The inscription read simply, "In memory of those who asked questions, and in honor of those who seek answers." As autumn came to Briarwood again, the townspeople were learning to live with the knowledge that the world contained horrors their grandparents could never have imagined. But they were also learning something else, that such horrors could be fought, that evil disguised as good could be exposed, and that sometimes the most faithful thing a person could do was to doubt. And in towns scattered across America, in churches where the pastor had served just a little too long, where families disappeared just a little too often, where questions were discouraged just a little too strongly, some people were beginning to wonder if their spiritual shepherds might be leading them somewhere other than salvation. The harvest was no longer going unnoticed. 1 year after the Easter Sunday revelation, Briarwood had become something unprecedented in American religious history. A town that actively encouraged its citizens to question everything, especially matters of faith. The empty church still stood as a reminder, but across the street a new building had been erected. Not a church, but a meeting house where people gathered not to worship, but to think, to question, and to share information that might save other communities from Briarwood's fate. Margaret Patterson had been elected to head what they called the Briarwood Documentation Project. Her kitchen table had been replaced by a proper office in the meeting house, filled with correspondence from across the country. What had started as a desperate attempt to warn others had evolved into an underground network of people who had survived similar experiences or were investigating unexplained phenomena in their own communities. "We have 13 confirmed cases now," she told Father Ashford as they reviewed the latest reports. 13 towns where the pattern matches what happened here, and in 3 of them, the pastors have been in place for more than 30 years. Father Ashford, who had regained much of his health and had chosen to remain in Briarwood rather than return to the diocese, studied the map they had created. Red pins marked confirmed locations, yellow pins indicated suspected cases, and black pins showed towns where their warnings had arrived too late. "Cedar Falls, Minnesota," he said, pointing to one of the black pins. "Pastor Jonathan Thorne served there for 38 years. When our letter arrived, the postmaster said the entire town had been abandoned overnight. Every building empty, every family gone without a trace." Timothy Hartwell, now 20 and bearing the weight of someone much older, entered with a telegram in his hand. His hair had gone prematurely gray after his experience in the church basement, but his resolve had only strengthened. "News from Montana, the town of Millbrook. Pastor Samuel Crane has been there for 39 years, and they're reporting families starting to disappear." Margaret felt the familiar chill that accompanied such news. "That means we have less than a year before he completes his cycle," Father Ashford finished. "The question is, are we ready to intervene directly?" It was the conversation they had been avoiding for months. The network they had built was excellent for gathering information and sending warnings, but what happened when warnings weren't enough? What happened when a community was too deeply under a harvester's influence to save itself? Dr. Blackwood arrived at that moment carrying a leather satchel that had become his constant companion. Inside were items that no medical bag should contain: blessed silver, iron nails from ancient churches, holy water from 7 different denominations, and copies of protection rituals that Father Ashford had reconstructed from memory. "I've been thinking about Montana," he said without preamble. "If we're going to act, we need to understand what we're up against." The entity that controlled Morrow, it wasn't unique. But each harvester seems to have different strengths, different weaknesses. He opened his satchel and pulled out a journal. Not unlike the one Pastor Morrow had used, but this one was filled with their own observations and theories. "I've been corresponding with a priest in Virginia who survived something similar 20 years ago. He says the harvesters adapt to their environments. Rural communities get the isolated shepherd approach. Urban areas see charismatic ministers who build megachurches. Coastal towns sometimes get ship captains who never age, leading communities that revolve around maritime traditions. The common thread," Father Ashford added, "is always the same: authority that goes unquestioned, isolation from outside influence, and gradual corruption of whatever faith or tradition holds the community together." Timothy spread out a map of Montana. "I've been researching Millbrook's history. Pastor Crane arrived in 1855, just after the previous minister died in what was reported as a hunting accident. The town's population has remained steady at around 200 people for 40 years, which is strange for a frontier community. Most either grow rapidly or are abandoned." Margaret studied the map, noting the town's location. "It's isolated. Nearest railroad stop is 30 miles away. No telegraph office. Mail comes once a week if weather permits." "Perfect hunting ground," Dr. Blackwood muttered. "The question is, can we get there in time, and what do we do if we can?" Father Ashford was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 40 years' imprisonment. "In my dreams, I still hear the voices of the other harvesters. They communicate with each other across vast distances, sharing techniques, warning each other of threats. If we move against one, the others will know. Then we better make sure we succeed," Margaret said with grim determination. "Because if we fail, we'll have painted targets on every community we've tried to protect." Timothy pulled out a telegram form and began writing. "I'll contact our people in Denver. If we're going to Montana, we'll need supplies, transportation, and backup plans." As they prepared for what might be their first direct confrontation with a harvester, none of them spoke about the obvious truth: that they were a small group of amateur monster hunters preparing to face an entity that had been perfecting its craft for nearly 4 decades, but they had something that Pastor Crane's isolated victims didn't have: knowledge, preparation, and the bitter experience of having survived one harvester's reign of terror. They knew the signs, understood the weaknesses, and most importantly, they knew that such creatures could be defeated. The train to Montana would leave in 3 days. By the time it arrived in Denver, their small group would either have saved 200 people from a fate worse than death, or they would have become the latest victims in a supernatural war that most of America didn't even know was being fought. Outside the meeting house, autumn was painting the trees of Briarwood in shades of gold and red. It should have been beautiful, but Margaret couldn't help thinking that it looked like the colors of fire, the kind of fire that purified, but only after it had destroyed everything in its path. The legacy of Pastor Morrow's final sermon would be written in the actions they took next. And somewhere in the mountains of Montana, a community was counting down to Easter without knowing that their salvation, or their damnation, was racing toward them on iron rails. In Millbrook, Pastor Samuel Crane stood at his study window, watching the first snowfall of what would be his final winter. 40 years of faithful service were almost complete, and his masters were pleased with his preparations. The basement of his church was ready, the chains were oiled and waiting, and his congregation trusted him completely. But something was different this year. Dreams had been reaching him, whispers of a town called Briarwood, of a harvester who had failed, of mortals who had learned to fight back. He smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp for any human mouth. Let them come. He had been preparing for 40 years, and unlike his brother who had grown complacent in that little town back east, Samuel Crane was ready for war. The final harvest was approaching, and this time, there would be no survivors to tell the tale. Epilogue. The endless vigil. 5 years had passed since the Easter Sunday that changed everything in Briarwood. The Briarwood Documentation Project had evolved into something far larger than its founders had ever imagined. A network of survivors, researchers, clergy, and ordinary citizens who had dedicated their lives to identifying and stopping supernatural predators that wore the masks of religious authority. Margaret Patterson, now in her 50s, stood before a gathering in Chicago that represented their greatest achievement and their gravest responsibility. 300 people filled the meeting hall, survivors from 17 different communities, each with their own story of escape from harvesters who had taken root in the soil of American faith. "We have stopped 12 confirmed harvesters," she announced to the assembled crowd. "We have rescued over 800 people from various forms of supernatural imprisonment, but for every victory, we discover 3 new cases that require investigation." The applause was subdued, respectful. Everyone in the room understood that their war was far from over. Timothy Hartwell, now 25 and bearing scars both visible and hidden, managed the logistical aspects of their operations. He had never married, never settled down. How could he, when he knew that in small towns across America, children were disappearing into basements that officially didn't exist? "Our latest intelligence suggests that the harvesters are adapting," he reported. "They're moving to larger population centers, taking positions in established denominations rather than isolated communities. The patterns are changing, which means our methods must change as well." Dr. Blackwood had established a medical wing of their organization, specializing in treating victims of supernatural trauma. His techniques were unorthodox, combining traditional medicine with protective rituals and careful psychological deprogramming, but they worked. More importantly, many of his patients eventually joined their cause, adding their knowledge and determination to the growing movement. Father Ashford, now recognized as their spiritual advisor despite never being officially reinstated by any church hierarchy, had spent 5 years documenting the theological implications of their discoveries. His writings were circulated privately among progressive clergy, preparing them to recognize and resist supernatural corruption within their own institutions. "The entities we fight are not demons in the traditional sense," he explained to a group of newly recruited investigators. "They are parasites that feed on faith itself, twisting devotion into bondage, corrupting worship into imprisonment. They succeed because they give people exactly what they think they want: certainty, community, and freedom from doubt." The meeting continued late into the night, with reports from field teams, updates on rescued survivors, and plans for future operations. But as the formal presentations ended and people began to leave, Margaret found herself alone with the original 4 survivors from Briarwood. "Do you ever regret it?" Timothy asked quietly. "The life we gave up to do this work?" Margaret considered the question seriously. She had never married, never had children, never experienced the quiet pleasures of a normal life. Her days were filled with horrors that most people couldn't imagine, and her nights were haunted by the knowledge of evils that still walked free. "No," she said finally. "Because somewhere tonight there's a family sitting down to dinner who don't know they're being watched by something that wants to chain them in a basement for eternity. There's a child saying prayers to a pastor who's counting down the days until he can harvest her soul. There's a community gathering for worship, not knowing they're walking into a trap that's been 40 years in the making." She looked around at her companions, her family really, bound together by shared trauma and common purpose. "We can't save everyone, but we can save some. And every person we save is a victory against forces that want to turn faith into fear, worship into imprisonment, salvation into damnation." Dr. Blackwood nodded, then pulled out a telegram that had arrived during the meeting. "Speaking of which, we have reports of unusual disappearances in a mining town in Colorado. The local pastor has been there for 37 years and the pattern matches our profiles. 3 years left," Timothy calculated automatically. "Then we have work to do," Father Ashford said, standing with the careful movements of a man who had spent too many years in chains but refused to let that experience define his limitations. As they prepared to leave Chicago and return to their various duties, Margaret looked back at the empty meeting hall. Tomorrow it would be used for a quilting circle or a women's auxiliary meeting. Normal people living normal lives, blissfully unaware that their continued freedom depended on a small group of broken individuals who had chosen to stand between humanity and horrors that should not exist. The original church in Briarwood still stood empty, but it was no longer a source of fear for the townspeople. Instead, it had become a reminder, not just of what they had survived, but of what they had learned. That faith without questions was not faith at all, but slavery. That trust without verification was not virtue, but vulnerability. That the most dangerous predators were often those who wore the faces of protectors. And in small towns across America, in places where the railroad didn't stop and the telegraph lines didn't reach, other Pastor Morrows continued their patient work, counting down the years until their own final sermons could begin. But now, for the first time in centuries, they were not working unopposed. The harvest would continue, but so would the resistance. And in the balance between those two forces, the soul of America would be decided. One church, one town, one act of courage at a time.